All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're going to call this public hearing of the Economic Development Committee to order. Tonight, we are discussing potential changes to the Department of Development's minimum qualifying incentive wage threshold policy. Currently, this policy states that only jobs that pay $15 per hour or more can qualify for city tax incentives. And per city code, this policy is up for review. During tonight's hearing, the Department of Development will summarize their strategy regarding economic development and their tax incentive portfolio, as well as present data on the pay scales of jobs that presently fall within the various deals within that portfolio. The department will also share national market wage data and will conclude with presentations with a recommendation for the policy moving forward. It is my hope that after tonight, members of the public, community advocates, and stakeholders will gain an even stronger understanding of how the City of Columbus uses its economic development tools to help create high-paying jobs and opportunities for Columbus families. Before continuing on, I would like to thank Chris Howe and the rest of the American FloorSource team for allowing us to use their space to hold this hearing out in the community. And I really want to underscore, why we are here today. One, we always want to make sure that we're getting out in the community outside of City Hall, because I think some of our best ideas come from the community. But more importantly, American FloorSource, I think, is a shining example of our economic development strategy. A company that has been in Columbus, but now, because of the work that we've been doing together in our economic development strategy, is expanding, significantly expanding here in the city of Columbus. I would also like to thank my colleague, Councilmember Dorns, for joining us this evening as we begin this conversation. If you have been following the efforts made by my office over this past year, you've heard me say this before. Economic development is about people. It's about the jobs our citizens receive that allow them to put food on the table and a roof over their head. It's about the benefits they receive that give them access to child care and high-quality health care. It's about the growth we've seen as a city as individuals and families move to Columbus looking for opportunity and community. Our growth demonstrates the health of our city and the success of our strategies, but it also is our biggest pain point. In 2022 to date, under my leadership, Council has approved development agreements that will bring over 2,000 jobs, 2,875 new jobs to our city, with a total payroll of $214,675,483 and a total capital investment of $912,362,136. Our economic development strategy is working, and Columbus has become an attractive market for private investment in a variety of industries. That said, I know, and this council knows, that with a wage threshold of only $15 an hour, we are not guaranteeing that every one of these jobs coming into our community through these deals provide our residents with a living wage, a wage suitable to live and work in the city of Columbus. With the rise in the costs of living due to our growing affordable housing crisis, the pandemic, inflation, international supply chains, and much more, now more than ever, we need to ensure that folks can do that they can live in the city in which they work. The policy being discussed tonight is a part of that larger goal and that larger vision. At this point, before we move to the Department of Development, I want to look to my colleague to see if there's any opening remarks or statements you might have. All right, thank you. So we're going to move right into our presentation, and we have with us this evening Quentin Harris, Deputy Director for Jobs and Economic Development for the Department of Development for the City of Columbus. Deputy?
Thank you, Councilmember Bankston, Councilmember Dorns. Happy to be here with everyone today. We'll start the presentation generally just talking about the Economic Development Division within the Department of Development, talk a little bit about what we do, what our mission is, and then scroll into some of our activities as it relates to how we conduct our business attraction, retention, and expansion activities, as well as our analysis regarding the minimum qualifying incentive wage rate. Within the Economic Development Division, we have 3 offices that primarily focuses on job creation, capital investment, and creating wealth and job opportunities for our residents here in Columbus. Our Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurial Development focuses on working with small business and entrepreneurs, helping them get from ideation until hopefully a viable small business. Our Office of Infrastructure Investment primarily works with developers and large companies that are focused on doing projects here in the city that include some type of capital investment that will have infrastructure needs like water, roads, sewer, or other types of infrastructure that we need to help facilitate the project. And that group primarily utilizes dollars from the city. And so that group has planners and engineers that try to maintain the city's capital investments through whether it's tax increment financing or capital funding that we are putting towards and supporting projects to make sure it happens on time and on budget to maximize the city's scarce resources. And then lastly is our Office of Business Assistance that we're going to primarily focus on here today, where their primary job is to first retain the businesses that we have here in the city and make sure that they're viable and look to help them expand into their existing market or new markets so that we maintain our existing tax base and utilize those revenues to provide basic city services for all of our residents. That group also focuses on business attraction, where we are looking to try and attract new companies to the city and the region, looking for new employment opportunities to provide our residents in a variety of different economic sectors. As a philosophy, the department's goal around economic development is to attract a broad base of companies that has a diversity in job descriptions as well as job skill levels so that we can make sure that we're creating economic opportunities for our residents that may have a high school education all the way to our PhD level residents so that they have a viable entry point into the workforce and once in can climb the economic ladder to growth and prosperity within that company or acquire skills that are then transferable to take those skills and transfer to another company within the sector that they've acquired those skills within the city or in a similarly situated sector where they do not have to go to another city. They can actually find those opportunities here within the city of Columbus. So in that attraction process, we utilize from time to time various economic development incentives depending on the trajectory of the project and the location that the company is focusing in on. Sometimes, or most of the times when we are working on economic development projects, we are in competition with communities that are within the Columbus region and in the state of Ohio. And then there are opportunities that we are competing with companies who are looking nationally and globally at various locales to place their expansion projects. And so we utilize these economic development tools, being our tax-based incentives, that's predicated upon the income tax proceeds that those net new jobs pay into the city. We provide a portion of those dollars back to the company, or we utilize programs like real property tax abatements that we utilize when a company is making a significant capital investment in the city. We utilize these tools to do a number of different things. We utilize these funds to help equalize the playing field as it relates to maybe deficiencies that we have in our site. Being an older city, sometimes we have projects that we are proposing for development that have certain types of contamination that needs to be remediated. And then we're often competing against greenfield sites that are accessible and ready to build immediately. And so sometimes we have to provide these economic development tools to equalize the playing field from a cost perspective, as well as possibly addressing some other deficiencies that then allows the company to take those proceeds over time and invest them back into the project, into their employees, because typically the way that our incentive toolkit works is the company has to make all of the investments up front, and our tools are provided back to the company over time as they perform, i.e., investing in the capital investment commitments that they've made as we negotiated the project, or as the jobs are created as committed to within those capital investment projects as well. So as they have performed, the Department of Development will provide those economic development incentives over a number of years back to the company to support the investments that they made up front in support of the project. So as we are going out and proactively working with a lot of our regional partners like One Columbus, the Columbus Franklin County Finance Authority, Jobs Ohio at the state level, as well as the Ohio Department of Development, as we are recruiting companies and in trying to attract companies to the region, we are proactively going after projects as well as receiving inquiries from companies as well. And as we assess these projects, we have established the economic development scorecard by which we look at a number of quantitative and qualitative factors that we assess when we are looking to potentially provide an economic development incentive to a company. A number of the quantitative factors that we look at the number of jobs to be created, the associated payroll that's associated with the creation of those new jobs, the capital investment that will be associated with the project, and primarily if they are an existing company looking to grow and expand, we also like to look at the number of existing jobs that are there and the associated wages with those existing jobs, because we never want to lose our existing tax base, because those are the dollars that we are providing current city services after. And so we are typically trying to be aggressive in retaining our existing tax base in those companies first. And so that's a very important metric that we look at as we are assessing the project from a quantitative perspective. From a qualitative perspective, we look at a number of factors that quite honestly emanated from Mayor Ginther's equity agenda and tenets that council have pressed upon development over the prior years of qualitative factors that are very important for us to try and maximize the economic development or the economic opportunities for our resident, and making sure that they take home as many dollars as possible in their employment situation. And so some of those qualitative factors that we look at is the company a Columbus grown and based company? Is the project located in a targeted, or what we call an opportunity neighborhood within the city of Columbus that's ripe for investment? is the project going to be along a transit line so that the opportunity for our residents to get to that place of employment is much easier and, quite frankly, equitable as it relates to being able to take public transit, not having to use their car, which is part and parcel to the city's sustainability goals that we have in a number of our sustainability plans. We also look at things like, will it be a mixed-use development? Because we want to try and maximize our land and focus on density above just sprawl. And so we're looking at mixed-use opportunities to try to create places where our residents can work, live, and play all at the same time, and have retail, commercial, office, and residential opportunities all in the same geographical area. We also look at things like, are the employer looking to hire restored citizens? Are they looking to provide additional capital investments or additional investment commitments to the community? Like, for example, if we were working with a bank and they're looking to offer financial literacy offerings to our K through 12 institutions, and working with some of our disadvantaged communities and making sure that they have financial literacy and understand how to go about planning and saving for the long term. Those are the type of opportunities that we're looking to partner with a number of the companies that we are looking to partner with and provide economic development incentives. And then we look at competition and are that entity really in competition of, if they're an existing business, move their operation to another city or state or country, or if there is no competition and they're just looking to expand and grow. And that's a significant factor that we look at. So as it relates to some of the opportunity areas that we focus on in the city that may have historically been disadvantaged from an investment perspective. Next slide, please. This map is a reflection of some of those areas that, if those capital investments are made in those communities, we are providing extra points within the scorecard, because these are areas that we're focusing on making investments with as it relates to, in partnership with companies and certain places from city resources we're looking to make investments in to improve the infrastructure in those areas and create job opportunities where residents can literally walk and have those job opportunities in their community instead of having to drive far away to other places, because then it provides them opportunities to be able to get to primary care type of opportunities for them and their family, access child care opportunities closer to where they work, which are all ways for our residents to maximize their economic development opportunity. Next slide, please. Other things that we look at, which are qualitative factors, are what we term enhanced benefits, which are more than what we think about when we talk about traditional benefits that companies provide their employees, more than vision, dental, and or life insurance. We're talking about benefits, enhanced benefits that, at least within our shop, we term reduces an employee's need to expand their take-home income. So things like companies offering subsidized transportation, subsidized childcare, where they may have a childcare facility within their building, and or provide financial benefits, whether it's upfront or after, from a reimbursement perspective for childcare. Whether it is student loan debt repayment options, and one of the things we like to see upfront when we're working with employers who provide tuition assistance is not reimbursement, because typically in those situations, an employee has to expend anywhere from, $1,500 to sometimes $5,000 or $6,000 a semester to go to school. For employers who are paying that tuition assistance upfront, so that the employee is not expending those dollars upfront or over time and then waiting for reimbursement later after they receive their grades, typically several weeks after the end of a semester. The company is actually paying their college tuition upfront, which then allows them to acquire some type of certification, 2 or 4 year degree, and be able to garner more by way of pay and or responsibility within the company once they have secured that degree. So these are the type of benefits, and I won't go through all, that we look at from a qualitative perspective when we're assessing a project. Is what additional benefits are they providing to the residents? What other additional benefits are they providing within the community that makes them good community partners, as well as helping our residents have more take-home income at the end of the day. So from, I think, those are the activities that we're typically working through when we're looking to potentially provide economic development incentives to a company. And once we have an opportunity to gauge those quantitative and qualitative factors, if that project reaches a certain level, that's when the Department of Development makes the recommendation to council for approval of the incentive offer in a competitive situation for us to try and attract and create capital investments and job creation within the city of Columbus. Generally, on average, during the course of a year, we are providing economic development incentives to roughly 18 to 24 projects a year, which on its face may sound like a lot, but we're talking about on average providing 1 to 1.5 or bringing 1 to 1.5 projects to council on a monthly basis. And for the 14th largest city in the country, and with a land mass of more than 200 square miles, we are very judicious with the incentive offers that we provide, but more importantly, the projects that we bring to council we think provides a great economic development return for the city as well as for the residents if we're able to win that economic development project. So with that general overview of our economic development activities and how we get to this point, the qualifying jobs that will qualify for our economic development incentives today must pay a minimum of $15 an hour. And that number has increased over a period of time. In the mid-2000s, that number was at $10 an hour. It changed early in the 2010, 2011 timeframe to $12 an hour, and then subsequently changed to $15 an hour roughly about 3 years ago. As the market has increased, Columbus has become more competitive from economic development perspective, and as our residents has needed more from an income perspective, we feel as if to provide economic development incentives, projects and wages need to be at a certain level for us to provide those economic benefits back to the companies that we partner with. And so this hearing is to assess whether that $15 an hour minimum qualifying incentive wage rate should increase, decrease, or stay the same. And so council asked us to do an analysis, and so we conducted that analysis over a period of time, and the first data point that we looked at was the 5-year historical average of our economic development portfolio, which is comprised of approximately 121 projects that are in our portfolio today. And from those projects, over a 5-year term, we have essentially have the numbers that we have in front of us. It's roughly 18 different NEX codes that we've synthesized those projects down within. And as you can look at roughly, on average, from an average hourly rate perspective, all but 2 of our sectors are above $20 an hour as it relates to average hourly pay. Of the 2, one, which is the NEX Code 81, which is kind of a catch-all, which is roughly $18.99 an hour. But the code that we've highlighted, which I think is a great microcosm to kind of take a look at, is our warehousing and distribution NEX code, which by sheer project you can see is the largest portion of our portfolio. Is roughly 1/4 of our portfolio projects are within the warehousing and distribution and logistics space, with 27 projects. From a job commitment perspective, we have 845. That number's a little deceptive from the perspective that typically the majority of these projects, when entered into, are made with the developer. And the developer is typically building the infrastructure and the building up front, typically on a speculative basis that we're then able to utilize in the recruitment of companies that are looking at expanding their operations around the country. So typically that number, for example, in those projects will far exceed the 845 that we hear, which is just a estimated average based on square footage when we perform deals just based on prior historical data. But as you can see, roughly from a net new payroll perspective, it has the 4th or 5th largest payroll with roughly $27 million of new payroll being brought into the city. But the number that stands out is roughly, it's about the average hourly wage is roughly $16.16 an hour. So we saw that number because warehousing and distribution is significant in the Columbus region and the city of Columbus specifically based on our location. We have great north, south, east, west access from Interstate 71 and Interstate 70 to go as far south as Florida, north into Canada, and east and west to both coasts. And so you can also reach about 46% of the U.S. population within an 8-hour drive from the city of Columbus. And so that makes us a great location to do business in and from. And that's why we have a significant warehousing presence within the city of Columbus, but also the Columbus region as a whole. And so because of that presence, and I'll talk about it and expand a little bit later, is from those warehousing opportunities that we have, primarily from a lot of large national companies that look and open up operations here in the city, it provides them a great lens into how Columbus is a really good place to do business. They can find employment for a very economical wage. The cost of land is not as excessive as the East or West Coast or down south in places like Texas. And the retention of a lot of our employees are a lot higher than some of those places because the cost of living makes it very manageable for people to have a great quality of life here in Columbus versus some of those other places. And so from those distribution and logistics opportunities, we have been able to cultivate relationships with a lot of these companies that have then created opportunities for us to leverage other facets of their operation, whether it's their back office function, i.e. their finance, HR, or other type of functions, or whether it's a manufacturing component of their business or their headquarters operation. We have been able to recruit other lines of business from a lot of those companies and bring them to the region. And so for all of those reasons, it warranted us to take a deeper dive into that specific NAICS code and try to understand what's going on in that particular sector. And so, next slide, please. So when we took a look into that specific NAICS code, we parsed the information by Franklin County warehousing jobs, Columbus region job, which is the entire Columbus MSA, as well as nationally, what are the wage rates that are being paid within that specific sector. Since the city of Columbus is roughly about 73% of Franklin County, we thought that was a good representation of Columbus, and so that's why we're using that data set. So as you can see, and I won't go through each specific job classification within that NAICS code, you can see if you look at the average hourly earnings within Franklin County and the city of Columbus, within that particular sector, we are very competitive from a wage perspective when you compare us to not only the Columbus region average, but the national average in all of those sectors. Minus the supervisor job description, we exceed every other job classification within the warehousing sector within the Columbus region today. And so from that perspective, it requires us to look at what is the national average and also look when we're looking to set our wages, that we also have to be cognizant of the sectors that we are looking to recruit and make sure that our policies are competitive with those respective sectors to make sure that we're competitive for future business attraction opportunities. And I would say, at least in this particular sector, I think we have actually been pushing the market to be more competitive from a wage perspective and move those wages closer to, I believe, what we would term a livable wage in those sectors. But typically, these are your entry-level jobs. They are lower skilled, essentially minus the top two job classifications, which typically requires either significant job experience or some type of degree from a supervisory perspective, or typically your industrial truck or tractor operators have some type of certification to operate those vehicles, which allows you to garner a higher wage rate. And so from that perspective, I think we are very competitive as a region with the national average. However, once again, I think our portfolio data was a 5-year look back. And so the $16.16 an hour was a 5-year look back at our warehousing and distribution wage rate specifically, but also the entire portfolio. And so when we looked at this data, this is current data over the last 2 years in this particular space. And so what we wanted to do is to actually look at existing job opportunities within the warehousing space that are being offered today. and what are those jobs being offered for in the warehousing and distribution space in the Columbus region. And looking at data from EMSI and Burning Glass, there were opportunities in the market at $18.29, which was a starting wage within the warehousing and distribution space. So we can see that within the past 2 years or so, the wages in this area is moving north, and it has over $2 over the last few years, and we believe it will continue to increase just because of the needs of that particular market to move goods and services, not only around the state and the country, but around the globe, with our moves to remote work and having more employees working remotely, as well as people, quite honestly, ordering more from their homes and not going out into the marketplace to actually buy goods. They're doing it online. And so that's increasing the activity as well as the wages in that particular space. Next slide, please. So from a recommendation perspective, the Department of Development recommends that the Columbus City Council consider an increase of the minimum qualifying incentive wage rate from $15 an hour to a rate somewhere between $18.50 and $20 an hour in order for a company to qualify for economic development incentive. We think just based on the trajectory of the market, what our current data is telling us, as well as moving our minimum qualifying incentive wage rate closer to living wage, we believe the data supports that move. I will caveat that I don't think specifically that the distribution and logistics space is quite there. And as you'll see in the next slide, it possibly may I'll say challenge us from a attraction perspective. Next slide, please. It may challenge us in being competitive in that particular sector going forward, because right now those jobs are going for roughly anywhere from $18 to $19 an hour. But it's an interesting sector, because typically in that particular sector, there's anywhere from 10 to 20% turnover on an annual basis. And so typically, those companies are incentivizing their employees from a retention perspective to stick around. And so typically in those sectors, and I will include call center operations in that space as well, typically after you start at an entry-level wage, which is typically, for example, the $18.29 an hour. And then after 3 or 6 months, you receive a incremental increase that's really based on retention. And then typically between that 6 and 12-month period, you receive another bump in pay, which typically then brings you closer to the wage frame that we've identified of $18.50 to $20 an hour, which there are projects, there are jobs today within a number of the projects that we recruit where a portion of those jobs don't qualify because they don't pay $15 an hour. And if during that incentive term, that job increases in pay and qualify, they will count for those subsequent years. And so we may have those type of opportunities that occur within jobs that we go after in this particular sector. But once again, I think this data is an opportunity for council to view and review and understand specifically how different sectors operate, and how for us, because warehousing is one of the sectors that we are most active in today, and that provides a lot of jobs and payroll. that it is, our change in policy could affect our attraction activities in that space. And it's just something to consider and to be aware of as it relates to the data, the historical data, as well as the current data that we've provided. Next slide, please. So, once again, I thank you for the opportunity to present to you, and I am open for any questions that you or the audience may have.
All right. Well, thank you, Deputy Director Harris. That was, I think, very insightful and very in-depth. So the way that the hearing will work going forward, so for those that are present and for those that are viewing online, the council members will ask questions, and then we'll open it up to the public for any kind of remarks or questions that you may have. So if you are online, please feel free to use the chat function. We have folks watching, so we want to make sure that we get your answers to your questions or any feedback that you may have, and make sure that we have that for the record. I'll start off with a couple questions, and then Councilmember Dorrance, you just chime in whenever you want to. One, I want to just clarify this policy, Deputy Director, that the policy only affects salaries of jobs created or maintained by approved tax incentive agreements with a company, correct?
That is correct. This minimum qualifying wage rate only applies to the city's incentive programs that we provide companies in a competitive attraction process. It does not affect any other policy or program within the city as it relates to a minimum qualifying wage rate.
Got it. So that just to clarify, that policy does not affect the wages of contractors or current city employees and folks that do business with the city?
Correct, it does not.
Got it. And then you actually answered one of my questions during the presentation was, how many deals do we do on average per year? And that was roughly between 18 and 24. But I think the bigger question is, because I think there's a misconception that anything that comes before us is accepted. About how many deals would you say are either given to us or that we go after and seek that we're either turning down because the scorecard doesn't meet that qualification, or that it just doesn't make sense for us?
The number of projects that we see varies from year to year. But however, I would say from projects that we proactively recruit and from projects that are provided to us from various partners like One Columbus, Jobs Ohio, the Ohio Department of Development, or that comes in from site selection consultants, we probably see within the city of Columbus roughly 100 or more opportunities for projects. We probably seriously consider whether we win those projects or lose them. Roughly 50 of those, so roughly about 50% of those projects meet criteria of projects that we would really want to have and win within the city. And then we probably win anywhere from 20 to 25% of those projects a year, which may not sound like a lot, but in the economic development field, that's actually a pretty good percentage from a recruitment and attraction perspective.
Right. And just to clarify, getting one of these incentives doesn't preclude you from doing business in the city of Columbus.
It does not.
I mean, there are projects that I see going up all the time around the city that do not have any type of incentive tied to it. And so I just want to make sure that we level set and understand that Columbus is a great place to do business. Absolutely it is. And we do get folks that just naturally come here. But there are key industries and key things that we want to make sure that we're competitive in. So can you talk about what some of those industries are that we have a gap in, or where we see competition that we can actually compete, that we want to attract and actually have here?
So I'm gonna go back and reference a point that you made earlier, and then I'll answer that question. All of the companies that we interact with in an attraction opportunities, they all aren't looking for economic development incentives. And sometimes we're not offering economic development incentives to that project. Sometimes we're just providing technical or regulatory types of assistance where we are helping that business to establish itself in the region, or we're helping that business with a specific infrastructure need that the city has purview over certain things from a regulatory perspective that may help them realize that project in the city. And so all the businesses that we're working with, our goal is not to provide them an economic development incentive. It's to try to create an environment that allows a business to move here on its own, and without many needs. But to your point, there are certain sectors that have certain needs where we have to equalize the playing field for a number of reasons. As I said earlier in my comments, sometimes there may be site deficiencies that we have to provide some economic development assistance to, because that site has more cost than another site in another city or state. And so to make that playing field level, we may have to provide, for example, a real property tax abatement to a site that needs to be cleaned. And so it may cost $1 million to clean this brownfield site, whereas in that competing state, it may not cost them anything because it's a greenfield, it's only been a farm, and so it's ready to be built on today. And so typically what our goal is just to equalize our site to the competing site, and then have all the other great investments that we've made in the city speak for itself. Great places to live, all of those things. And so there are, on the flip side, other sectors where we do not have a foothold in. And so, for example, I'll use the Intel project. So we do not have any semiconductor manufacturers or a significant presence within the city of Columbus, for example, or quite honestly, many assets within that sector within the Columbus region. And so for that project, we had, as a region, to be very aggressive in our attraction activity. That project ultimately landed in the city of New Albany, which is adjacent to us, but we are partnering with them because they needed our assistance to provide water and sewer capacity to that project. And so we're very familiar with that particular project. And so to attract that company here, we needed to have some physical assets where we had to put certain things on the table. But that industry will follow a large prime like Intel, and it will create a industry that quite honestly wasn't on our next code that isn't here today. There will be another line item on that chart in 2 years from now, because some of those companies that will follow Intel to come to the region will locate their business somewhere within the city of Columbus. And so we'll have a new next code that will support that specific sector. And so we need to make certain investments ourselves or in companies to help recruit that sector to the city, because typically companies follow other companies within that space, because typically that means there are assets that are there in place. There are other companies that are doing the same things that they're doing, and that typically means I can do it there too. And you have human capital, right? You have the workforce there that you can recruit from that are already doing the job today. So hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore something, because this comes up, and we have to think, I think, regionally when it comes to this, but also, our purview as council members and as a Department of Development is to think about Columbus proper and our residents. And so, although something that comes to the region may be good for Columbus, there's an indirect benefit there, right? And so sure that we are balancing that and being competitive. So as those industries come, they're located in the city of Columbus so that we receive that income tax, which is so critical to the services that we provide. Councilmember Dorns, I'm open up for you if you have any questions.
Sure. Thank you, Councilmember Banks, and I appreciate you holding the hearing tonight. And I think this subject was one of the first that we sort of started talking about when you first joined council and took over the Economic Development Committee. So appreciate you hosting this hearing and having us here tonight. So Deputy Director, I have a couple of questions for you. Some are more philosophical and some are sort of more down in the weeds. And I want to get back to sort of that scorecard that you sort of listed for residents earlier. And wages is one of, many different things on that scorecard, right? I just want to sort of ask the broad question when we think about incentivizing individual jobs in the city of Columbus from a philosophical standpoint. And I think Councilmember Bankston has brought this up a number of times in his remarks already tonight. But it's about the sort of holistic aspect of the job from my view. One of the things that I ask about every time, incentive agreement comes from your office to ours is what are the wages and what are the benefits, right? So, can you just talk a little bit about the department's view of how we're evaluating that scorecard to the point where a deal makes sense to move forward when we think about how holistically that supports a worker, that then supports a family, that then supports income tax for the city?
So, I think ultimately the scorecard, we structure it so that based on every data point that's checked, the project receives more weight based on, simplistically, the more checks that it have, right? And those checks are related to a lot of those qualitative and quantitative factors, right? Because that scorecard is a reflection of, we believe, the city's priority around equity and opportunity. And so the more checks that are checked on the list, that means this project reflects the priorities of the city. And the projects that don't. And so typically, you spend your money and your resources supporting endeavors that reflects your priorities. And so that's the way we have approached the scorecard through those quantitative and qualitative factors. Or we make sure that the project is supporting all the tenets that we want as it relates to the investments that the company is looking to make and the return that the city will get as it relates to the tax revenue that will be provided based on the incentives that will be provided. And then we look at all of the qualitative factors and making sure that our resident is getting a good hourly wage, that the company is the type of company that not only is looking to make revenue for their shareholders, we want to also make sure that they are the type of companies who are looking to value and take care of their employees, who typically are the residents of the city of Columbus. And so having those additional benefits that they're providing their residents, once again, I think is reflective of allowing them to take more of their take-home hourly pay home. But it also provides a better environment where, quite honestly, our residents are healthier because they have less things to worry about and can provide more to their families when they leave work and go home. And then I think lastly, the scorecard provides a rubric that we can consistently refer to as it relates to whether I'm here or not, the priorities of the city, and we can continue to follow those tenets and make sure that the priorities, regardless of who's assessing the projects, are reflective of the administration's and council's tenets of what we want to see when we partner and provide our scarce resources to companies, and making sure that we're getting an appropriate return so that we can provide all those city services that we were talking about.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Want to sort of dive into this. I think one of the things that when we talk about residents is that, I think that there is, some level of frustration anytime you're talking about economic incentives as it relates to private businesses, right? We can't ignore that, whether it's, regional competition, whether or not that's, suburbs right outside 270 or those within Ohio or across the Midwest, also offer, incentives, so we live with the reality of the world that we meet it in, right? So when we think about a lot of our philosophy around, incentivizing, good paying careers to be here in Central Ohio, obviously we measure ourselves against other cities, other regions. When we talk about from a wage threshold standpoint, looking at other cities, other regions, how do we stack up at today, and how would this potential recommendation from an $18.50 to $20 an hour sort of stack up against that?
So we didn't necessarily conduct an analysis as it relates to how that particular metric measures up to a number of our other communities. But anecdotally, definitely we are aware that there are a lot of communities that do not have a minimum qualifying wage rate. Certain communities put priorities and preferences on certain things. There are certain communities that recruit certain sectors only and will only incentivize certain sectors, whether it's biomedical or finance, insurance, and so they've focused on having certain job categories within their community. And then there are some communities who do look at the minimum average wage, and they clarify their incentive policy along those lines. So I guess in short, there is no one standard that a lot of communities judge their incentive portfolio by. I think going back to a statement that Councilmember Bankston said around a lot of communities provide incentives based on the needs of the community. And that varies from a smaller city that may want to see certain types of investment, and so they incentivize those specific investments, to larger cities like Columbus that are very large as it relates to land mass, and our specific policy around creating a diversity of jobs, so that, like some communities, for example, who only recruit, scientific or finance and banking, you have to have a certain educational level to get some of those opportunities. And so we don't want our residents to have to drive 20, 30 miles away to another community to have those opportunities, as long as those opportunities provide a living wage for them to be successful here. That those are the type of companies and the broad diversity of sectors that we recruit as economic development.
So fair to say, because there's not sort of an existing standard, across the economic development sphere, we know through Jobs Ohio, other economic development organizations, not only here in Ohio, but across the country that you and others, network with and that kind of thing. The ability for council and the administration to sit down and say, here's our line. If you don't meet that, we're not going to have a conversation with you. That gives us as an opportunity here in Columbus really to say, this is the minimum threshold. And the reason we're coming at this minimum threshold is a data-driven point about what it costs for an individual to be able to afford to live in Columbus. And I think that's something that's really important, I think, from a council standpoint, I think from an administration standpoint, to really point out to residents is that whatever number we land on here today, so we're at 15 based on the work of people that were working on this years ago, that is an important thing for us as a community to really draw a line here and say, based on how we see the community growing, this is where we need to be.
Yes.
So when you look at that, and again, I'm going to deal with whole numbers here because you started 1850. You're going to lose my math here pretty quick. But if we go from 15 to 20, that represents over a 30% increase. When you look at sort of the data points that you've provided here tonight, obviously the logistics and warehousing sector stands out as one in which, right now it is not there. But I think one of the comments you made earlier, I think is fairly poignant on this, is that, our policy has helped to move that sector in the past. Now, obviously, with the inflationary pressures that have happened over the past 2.5 years, that has also contributed greatly. But from, your guy who's been doing this work for a while, when you saw initially we go from 12 to 15, have you seen consistently companies following that line? So a sector that may have not been paying that before, get to it or closer after we've drawn that line and said, here's our minimum threshold? Again, just asking as somebody who's done this work here in our community for a while.
Yes, I think to be very fair and candid, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen companies who have said, thank you, this is, our wage rate, and we're going to assess other opportunities. And then we have seen companies who had made the adjustments based on our policy. So that's definitely the case. I think, we are one of the select communities who do have a line by which we tell companies you have to meet the parameters of this line in order to qualify for our incentives. And I think at the end of the day, we understand that policy, and that's around a lot of the other quantitative and qualitative factors that we assess, that if you don't meet certain parameters, I think we are okay with missing out on some opportunities because the return won't be enough for our residents for us to make those types of investments. And I think having this minimum qualifying wage rate, which I will say, a number of years ago, I was hesitant to support personally when it was put in. Over time, I reflected, and it is definitely a bar because, quite honestly, it provides standards, and it provides standards to the marketplace that, we really assess the importance of our resources, that we're looking to partner with you on a project, and that we have certain standards that you have to meet and that we're willing to partner with you on. And if not, we're okay with missing out on some opportunities. And in a lot of communities don't do that. And then there's a lot of communities that, quite honestly, aren't in a position to do that. And as Councilmember Baston said at the beginning of his remarks, we're in a position where we are able to tell the marketplace that. Now, that's always a fine line, but I think we have still been competitive in our attraction of a number of projects, even with these standards. And hopefully the market is open to whatever number council ends up with, and that we remain competitive in the marketplace as well.
So this is maybe, I think there's a question in here. I don't think it's just a statement. I think there actually is a question in here. But when you talk about like the two different like data points here, right? So we have, when you look at sort of the current deals that we have done, looking at the wages where they're at. So clearly for many of the industries, we can say, hey, they're at well over $20 an hour. They've overperformed. That's great. So, this kind of change is not really going to affect that industry whatsoever, even though, that's a past deal. So any change right now would not be retroactive. It would be sort of, again, new deals moving forward. But again, based upon the past history, we're not looking at there being any, significant disruption there. But the other data point that I think is important for us just to say out loud, and I'm assuming this is one of the things that the department has looked at, is, what does it cost for folks to live in Central Ohio? Obviously, that's a very different thing now, 3 years ago compared to today, especially when you factor in the inflationary pressures where we're at now. So just to sort of ask the question out loud, not only is this recommendation a question of what we think that we've seen based upon the wage growth of the industries that we've already incentivized, so we can, move folks forward based upon where folks are already at, but also an evaluation of what does it cost for people to live in Central Ohio. Is it fair to say the recommendation is based upon basically a view of those two things?
Yes, wholeheartedly. I mean, as the years occur, and the market dynamics change, and quite honestly, the labor force evolves. The demand changes. And so over time, as we've seen, we have slowly moved that number north to reflect the changes in our marketplace. Fortunately for the city of Columbus, we have been very fortunate since the mid-2000s, and we've had a few economic lulls, but overall, we have been able to continue to expand our economy and add more companies and opportunities, which then allows us to continue to advance that number as you're articulating. We don't foresee that market changing much with the level of activity that my group sees on a weekly and monthly basis. That number, the number of projects that we're seeing continue to come in the door. And so from that perspective, we're in a position, like some other markets across the country, to be able to set policies like this and be able to provide more opportunities to our residents, which ultimately is what we're trying to do. Just the balance act that we, as development officials, try to do is to make sure that we balance those numbers so that we can bring in, so that we will win a certain number of projects so that we can continue to provide a certain level of basic city services for our residents that they've come to expect.
Thank you. Last, and I think this is absolutely more of a statement, but I want you to chime in on this, because when we talk about that scorecard about capital investment into a project, I think one of the things that it's very easy for folks to sort of gloss over very quickly. So when we're talking about incentivizing, individual jobs based upon the end use of the project, right? That doesn't talk about necessarily the income tax generation from the capital investment. So, when you're talking about, $100 million for a data center or otherwise, you're talking about, 2.5% of the income tax of the folks building that project. And some of those, capital investments are in tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, and that is captured outside of these agreements.
Correct.
So when we talk about we're going to incentivize the creation of these jobs, it meets our standards. This is income tax, so you're keeping the school district and other institutions whole. There is another additional, revenue source in the city because of that capital investment of dozens, if not hundreds, of folks constructing that at that 2.5% return to the city. So when we talk about holistically, we've got the scorecard from your vantage point of what the deal does, but I think it's important for us to sit back and say from a capital investment standpoint that is an additional return on top of the jobs that are created there.
That is correct. So I'll bring up a couple different other revenue points. As you articulated, typically when we're working with companies and they are creating new infrastructure or working to improve or expand on existing infrastructure, there's a construction period that occurs, and we're hiring tens to hundreds of jobs that are making that project happen in the city, which are jobs we don't capture for purposes of our incentive reporting. They are numbers we capture for purposes of revenue sharing with the school district, per Ohio law that we have to do. But those are jobs that occur all the time, that are providing economic benefit and stability to our residents. And then, as you stated, there are the real property tax taxes that we're receiving from the project as well. The city essentially utilizes, or the city's annual budget utilizes, I think about 74% of the city's annual budget is based off of income tax receipts. Real property taxes, the city gets roughly 4.3 to 4.8% of that. Which is a significant revenue stream when you're talking about projects that are tens and hundreds of millions of dollars from an assessed perspective. But Those investments are going to support our levy agencies, are going to support our school districts and the county as well, which provides them revenue that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't been successful in our attraction activities. And so those activities matter, and that revenue matters as well in what we're doing. And we primarily, as the city, or at least our shop, we really focus in on income taxes, but there are real property taxes, and there are other ancillary benefits that employees as well as the community also receives in some of our projects as well, because we also try to work with companies when we're providing economic development incentives who are looking to be good community partners and are looking to provide assistance and become part and parcel with the community and neighborhood that they're locating in. And so we have companies who come in and look to help communities expand their tree canopy and plant trees, and there are other companies that come in and provide financial literacy services to the neighborhood school district, and other ancillary benefits. And so those are things that we look at and we talk with companies about on an annual basis, that provides benefits, not only to the city, but our residents and our neighborhoods as well.
Thank you, Deputy Director. That's all the question I have for right now.
Thank you.
Shape.
Thank you, Deputy Director, and thank you, Councilmember Dorns. And actually, I think from that question, you mentioned something that I think sometimes gets overlooked, and if you can give us a little short snippet on it. You said revenue sharing, and revenue sharing that goes back to our school district. And so part of our economic development strategy around that income tax does benefit our schools and other agencies. So can you talk about that revenue sharing portion really quickly? And then also on top of that, I think talking about that capital investment, because that's more of the long-term strategy there. And I know that there's individual projects, and we've talked about one in particular where the property value sitting empty, right, is only a couple $100, but now it's met its 15-year mark, and now it's producing over $400,000 for our schools. So if you can just talk about the revenue sharing and then our long-term strategy from the capital investment standpoint.
Definitely. So from a revenue sharing perspective, when we utilize our real property tax abatement program specifically, which is an enterprise zone or a community revitalization area abatement, per Ohio law, communities have to revenue share with the school district when the income tax, the net new income taxes generated by the project exceeds $1 million in new income taxes to that community. And so typically, when we are providing a real property tax abatement, typically it's at a percentage of 10 years and 75%. That's our standard abatement policy. Per the Ohio Revised Code, an abatement can be as much as 100% for up to 15 years. But Columbus's policy is traditionally 10 years, 75%. And so when we provide a real property tax abatement to a company, a few things happen. When that payroll is over $1 million for the term of that abatement, typically 10 years, on an annual basis, anything that is generated over $1 million from income tax perspective, the city shares with the school district 50-50. So if $5 million is created in income tax, from the $4 million, the city's getting $2 million and the school district is getting $2 million on an annual basis. And every year, as that income tax total increase, typically as it does, that revenue split increases every year and provided to the school district. And that's in consideration of them foregoing some of the real property taxes that they would have received if the abatement wasn't in place. However, based on our current policy, so they're receiving the revenue share, but they're also receiving the amount of real property taxes that they were receiving the day before the project was built. So whatever they were receiving before that project was put in place, they're still receiving. And then they're receiving 25%, since we're only providing a 75% real property tax abatement to the company. They're only receiving a benefit of 75% of that value. The school districts are getting that 25% on an annual basis of whatever that new project is generating from a real property tax perspective. So that's 3 revenue streams. Whatever it was getting before the project happened, the income tax revenue share, and then that incremental increase based on that new project. So they're getting 3 revenue streams, whereas before that project, they were only getting the 1. And then at the terminus of that agreement, year 11, then they'll be getting 100% of what they would be getting based on the value of that project generating from a real property tax perspective. And so the way we term it is, the city and the school district are making long-term investments together. And we're partnering, we're both, giving up revenue to each other and to the company for the greater good of having a more viable city with more capital investments and structures in it that generate more real property tax as well as income tax to not only the city, but the school district, county, and all the levy agencies to provide all the services that we would want to see on an annual basis. And then the second part of your question, if you can remind me what it was.
Yeah, you hit on it, but just the example that I'm always fascinated by, and there was a particular site, and you don't have to name the site in particular, but that difference in revenue after the deal has reached its 10 or 15-year mark, and how much it's generating both in real property tax and income tax on a parcel that was once vacant.
Definitely. And so, as I just mentioned, that 75% that was going to the company to help reimburse a portion of the investment that they made in that project. Now at the year 11 is what we call it. Now the school district and all of the county, the city, and the levy agencies are now all getting 100% of that revenue, which is really important because once again, I think we all are making short-term sacrifices to have a more of a windfall at the end of that project period. Because if we're not able to ever win that project, you're only going to be receiving that number you were receiving day one, right? And so with that investment that we all are making, hopefully the goal is at year 11, we all are receiving significantly more revenue based on the investments that the city and the company has made over the long term.
And just want to underscore that they have a time limit.
Yes.
This is not in perpetuity that they get this incentive. It is for a certain period of time. We do have 2 questions online. I want to make sure that we get them. Ms. Susan Fawcett is watching with us via YouTube. So thank you, Ms. Susan, for tuning in. She has 2 questions here. One is that she says lower skilled jobs were mentioned earlier, and I think that was around the warehousing piece. And her question is, if we offer incentives to bring lower skilled jobs, who is filling the financial gap when we bring low skilled jobs to Columbus?
I'm trying to understand who fills the gaps.
Yeah, I think her question is more around, if we are incentivizing lower skilled jobs to the region, then who picks up that gap in wages, or who's filling that the gap in the community, which would be, of course, a multitude of partners in the safety net that we have in place.
So understood, and hopefully I'm answering your question accurately. I think from that perspective, and I think when we talk about lower skill jobs, we aren't really saying low paying jobs per se. Folks a certain segment of our community would argue that $15 an hour is a decent wage in order for a person to live on. We can have discussions on a family versus a person. Because roughly someone who is making $15 an hour roughly makes about $31,200 a year. And that, anywhere between that and $20 an hour, that person is roughly making $41,600 a year. Between that $15 and $20 an hour in that sphere there. So, ultimately, I think what we are talking about is creating an opportunity that, once again, still have to fit between the $15 where it is currently and at least development's recommendation of $18.50 to $20 an hour. So I'm just going to have to fit in between that $15 and $20 an hour. They still have to pay well, but from a skilled perspective, we want to create opportunities because everyone isn't going to go to college. And a large number of the jobs, you can go look on any job board there is out there, a lot of those jobs require a four-year degree. What we want to also create opportunities for our residents are individuals who choose not to go to school or to a four-year institution of higher learning, but choose to go the technical route or choose to garner certifications that, quite honestly, in the long run, allows them to potentially make just as much as a student that makes or that has a four-year degree, but they don't have the student debt behind them that some of those individuals will have, and they actually have more disposable income that 30% isn't going towards their college loan repayment, for example. And so we're trying to create low-skill opportunities because hopefully what we want to see is those individuals to get a job opportunity with one of these organizations and then have that company train up, whether it's certification, whether it's providing them tuition assistance to get a 2-year degree or 4-year degree within that company, and then be able to leverage that opportunity and make more dollars. And so that's our ultimate goal. And so having multiple sectors and job opportunities for our residents at multiple places on the economical ladder is part of our development philosophy.
And if I can just add, Deputy Director, in some of these discussions that Councilmember Banks and I have had, I think gets directly to the question from the woman, Ms. Susan, online, is the question of, what does it cost to live here, right? So I think her question is about, hey, if we have a low-wage, low-skill job, the social safety net has to pick up the balance of helping that individual and family pay for housing and groceries and transportation and all those things they need to be stable, right? So, but I think that gets at the crux of why we're here today is the question of what is the wage that we can comfortably say that if an individual gets that job under one of these agreements, that we don't have to worry about them relying upon the social safety net in order to have the stability their family needs. So, I look a lot at the Affordable Housing Alliance here in Columbus, what they have pegged that folks need to make in order to, afford, good housing in our community. And I think ultimately that's what the question here is that we don't want to use our incentive policies to incentive jobs that then create opportunities for folks to have to rely upon some other type of subsidy. I think that's also one of the reasons why, when you mentioned earlier, not every community has this kind of threshold in place. Why I'm glad that we have these kind of discussions to make sure we're not accidentally putting people in a position in which they are facing more poverty within their family and their community as a direct result of that employer not holding up their end of the bargain while they're receiving a public subsidy. Certainly, we have employers that, don't pay a living wage in Columbus, and we wish they would, but that's not what, this conversation is about. So I think, from our vantage point, this is a tool in the toolbox of creating more career opportunities that ensure that folks don't have to rely upon that social safety net.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think too, Councilmember Dorns, it's kind of our larger philosophy at council. The wage is only one part of living in the city, right? It's also about childcare costs. It's about transportation costs. It's about affordable housing, and I think that this council sees that picture holistically. So we're talking about the job and the wage now, but we're also under, Council President Pro Tem's leadership, investing more in childcare so we can lower the childcare costs. Thanks to you, we're tackling things like wage theft to make sure folks are getting paid. So it's really a holistic conversation. The wage is just one piece of it. So thank you, Ms. Susan. And then lastly, Ms. Susan had another question. How do you prevent the minimum rates from artificially increasing the value of the job, which can lead to inflation?
Good question.
Ms. Susan is good.
Yes, she is. She is. Well, typically, those, the market sets the wage, right? And so, in one sense, our number is predicated upon a lot of market data. So we aren't unilaterally and/or arbitrarily setting a wage and hope that the market reaches or meets it. We're taking data from the market, i.e. the 5-year analysis of our portfolio, seeing what all of those sectors are paying their employees historically, and then we're looking at current data and we're seeing what the market is paying now. And then, as Councilmember Doran said, we're looking at other data sets like what it takes for an individual to be able to afford housing as well as eat and have dollars to transport themselves where they need to, based on whether you're a single individual, have 1 child, 2 child, or 3 children. Those are the data sets that we're looking at, and all of those data points together are helping us get to this minimum qualifying incentive wage rate to be able to qualify for an incentive through one of the city's incentive programs if you are a company looking to expand or locate their operations here in the city of Columbus.
All right, thank you, Deputy Director. And as we wrap up, Councilmember Dorns, any further comments or questions from you as we close?
Just again, thanks to Chair Bankston and Deputy Director for being here tonight. I think the focus should be on how we ended this, about if we have to be in a position to provide incentives because of the competition that exists within the economic development marketplace, how do we focus that on building well-paying careers for folks? I think, to your point, Deputy Director, at all different types of industries, to make sure that residents that can enter into a career that can support their families and move up within their lives to have that kind of stability that we know they need and want, and that's how we build a stronger Columbus together. So just appreciate the conversation here, and I appreciate the recommendation from the department, and look forward to under Councilmember Banks' leadership reviewing that recommendation and ultimately moving something forward to council here soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilmember Dorans. And this was a great, robust conversation, and I think that our goal here, and at the end of the day, the policy is to review the wage. But I think tied to that wage, more importantly, what I wanted to make sure that the public came across with is, what is our values as a community? How do we utilize economic development tools that we have, and what does that look like? Oftentimes, I think we see these things come up at council meetings, but don't understand how they got there, what the work was done behind the scenes. And so hopefully this shedded some light on that. I just want to talk next steps, and then we'll close out. So we've heard the recommendation from the Department of Development to increase that wage between $18.50 to $20. It is now on council to assess that, and we as a council will come up with our final recommendations and passage of that. We are planning to have a second hearing on this topic in mid-October to hear thoughts from stakeholders, industry experts, and constituents on the info provided tonight, and the direction that would like council to take with updating this policy. So in between that second public hearing that we will have in mid-October, my office and other council offices will meet with stakeholders and engage with them to gather more data, have those presentations, and want to hear from the community in a reaction to this recommendation. I would like to thank Director Mike Stevens, Deputy Director Quentin Harris, and Jennifer Finning, and the rest of the great team at the Department of Neighborhoods for putting together this info for this hearing. Please keep an eye out for an announcement from my office regarding the date and time and location of the second hearing coming soon. And we are looking forward to continue this robust conversation. Thank you all again for being here tonight and for tuning in with us. And that concludes our hearing.